Why Africa and why now? First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, embarks on a major goodwill tour of the African continent. This, as the Chinese government showers African countries with new infrastructure projects and billions of dollars in foreign aid and loans. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. On today's show, the influx of investment into Africa. Mark Green, administrator of the U.S. Agency on International Development, explains the current administration's policy on America's investment in Africa and how the United States plans to keep up with China's growing influence in the region. International reporter Salim Solomon of VOA Africa joins us in studio to discuss African sentiments on foreign aid and the risk of growing debt throughout the continent. We're also joined by VOA Beijing Bureau Chief Bill Ide, who joins us via Skype to give us insight into the Chinese strategy and why China is so aggressively investing in Africa. We are live on Facebook at Voice of America and want your comments and questions. First Lady Melania Trump just concluded her first ever solo international trip, where she came face to face with students, baby elephants, and the Great Sphinx during her week-long four-nation goodwill tour of Africa. The First Lady was there to witness firsthand just how U.S. aid initiatives are impacting African nations and to promote her Be Best initiative. Mrs. Trump's visit comes 10 months after President Donald Trump reportedly made an infamous disparaging remark about some African nations. That has critics questioning whether the visit was simply a photo op or a sign that America is ready to move relations forward with some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Here is more on the First Lady's first solo trip from VOA White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara.
Melania Trump came to Africa promoting her Be Best campaign, which focuses on children's social, emotional, and physical health. On her final stop in Cairo, the First Lady delivered this message on behalf of her husband's administration.
We want to show the world that we care, and I partnered and I'm working with the USAID, and I'm meeting some of them here as well. And that's what I want to show, that we care.
Her message aims to resonate in Africa, where many programs depend on USAID funding and where child and maternal health are big concerns.
It's a good opportunity for enhanced relations between Kenya and the US, especially since our First Lady in Kenya, Mrs. Kenyatta, she has programs relating to maternal health care.
But some have questioned the timing and the motivation of the First Lady's visit.
I think this is more about making amends for her husband after the remarks he made about Africa. So they're trying to maybe find a way to slowly gain the trust or the favor of African leaders.
If she was in line with what her husband believes in, I don't think she could have made this trip. She's just sending a message maybe to the husband to say, you know, we must be part of the people across the world, whether they are developing, whether they are developed, as long as they are people, they need American support.
Melania Trump's visit also focused on conservation efforts. Political analyst Vincent Condowe says it does not have to be seen as a counter to her husband's rhetoric.
Well, generally, it's the general perception that Donald Trump does not have a clear view of what Africa stands for. You remember this other time he talked about a fictional African state, Nambia, was it something like that? It looks like he has got a broad view of what Africa stands for or what Africa is all about. And I gather that neither Melania Trump nor Donald Trump has been to Africa. So this is the first visit by the First Lady, the current First Lady, to Africa. So for me, this is a message of goodwill.
Although the First Lady's Africa tour generally drew positive reviews, there was relatively little local media coverage ahead of her stops, partly because the White House released very few advance details. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Nairobi.
Last week, the United States Senate passed the Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development Act, or the BUILD Act. This new bill allows for the creation of the United States International Development Finance Corporation, a brand new American agency that will have a $60 billion budget and the authority to take equity positions on investments. Some say this could be a boon for American investment in Africa. I spoke to Mark Green, administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, about the Trump administration's position on aid and investment in Africa and his warning to African nations about doing business with China. He also explained why the First Lady chose Africa for her first solo trip.
I think it's because of her great interest in children, and she understands that Africa demographically is the young continent. There are so many young people who are reaching crossroads moments in their countries, and so I think she wanted to see what it is that we're doing to help forward that and push that along. So she was great to work with. She loved her time there, and they loved her.
She went to a number of countries. I think she went to 4 or 5 countries. Why were those chosen as opposed to some other countries?
I think it's because those countries each illustrated a part of American assistance in Africa. So in Ghana, she had a chance to see our global health work in action, how we're helping to train healthcare workers and nurses to lead their own system. Malawi is a country that has real challenges demographically and in terms of literacy rates, and we have education programs, and she wanted to see that. So I think she chose the countries because she wanted to see the kinds of things that we're doing for herself personally.
How was she received?
Oh, she's a wonderful, gracious person. They loved having her. She drew crowds everywhere she went. So yeah, it was a great experience. It was wonderful for raising America's profile in Africa, and from my selfish perspective, our programs in Africa.
Well, the United States, there have been reports that the Trump administration, her husband, has wanted to cut the funding to USAID, and we use the word slash. I mean, quite substantial. We hear numbers like a third. She doesn't seem to support that.
Well, she believes in our programs, and I think that everywhere we went, she talked about the importance of them. There's a lot of talk out there. What I always tell people is USAID is in the operations side. So we're the ones who help America's values and principles and assistance go into action. So what I tell people is don't pay attention to wording as much as what you see. And we're working in some of the toughest places in the continent. We're helping to lift lives, build communities, and I think build a brighter future for so many young Africans.
Well, USAID is in a number of countries across the African continent, but China's also in Africa doing a number of developmental projects. Is there a way to describe the different strategies, or are they the same?
Oh, they're fundamentally different. So what we always say is we're working to help countries on their journey to self-reliance. What we want is for countries to lead their own bright future. We want them to go from being traditional assistance recipients to partners to fellow donors. China's a very different model. They build dependency. So the choice is self-reliance versus almost servitude. What they do are loans. And as we're learning more and more, often unsustainable financing that mortgages a country's future. We don't. What we ask for is that countries take on their own challenges, foster their self-reliance, build their next generation of leaders, and then join us in terms of leadership around the world.
What's the expectation if China is more of a loan type strategy to the African continent? What happens when these loans come due and the country can't pay it? What's the expectation?
Well, in some cases, they mortgage strategic assets. So you see ports being essentially taken over by China, sole exclusive use of those ports. Dangerously extractives, oftentimes strategic minerals. What should be the birthright of young Africans is tied up by financing from China. And so what happens is those young Africans never see the benefits. They never see the broad-based economic growth based upon their resources. Instead, the benefits go elsewhere.
Well, so it seems like there are strings attached for the Chinese program. But are there no strings attached when Americans, through the USAID, give money? Or is there no expectation in return other than some sort of, we want you to prosper? Do we ask for nothing in return?
Well, we ask for reforms. We ask them to respect certain rights and values. What we want for them is to become eventually trading partners, but equal partners in that. And the way that you do that is incentivize market-based reforms, build their capacity, increase their incomes. So we want them to move in terms of fully independent, sovereign nations, leading their own future and becoming partners of ours.
Is there an African nation that the United States and China are really sort of aggressively trying to get involved in the same country, so there's almost sort of an internal competition for the hearts and minds of the citizens?
Well, I don't think we look at it like that. We're working in just about every country in Africa, and we're doing so because of what we see, the potential that we see, or in some cases the need that's there. So, we're talking a lot about the development assistance side of things, but there's the humanitarian side. We are far and away the largest humanitarian donor in the world, and 2, 3, and 4 together don't match up with the U.S. So we're feeding hungry South Sudanese. We're working in places like DRC where there are terrible humanitarian problems. So that's a whole other side. We wish that China would join us in humanitarian assistance. It would be great if China were to come to the table and help lift lives and help build the next generation of leaders, and unfortunately they're just not.
Right now, the biggest challenge to U.S. influence in Africa is, of course, China, which is the second largest economy in the world. China is investing more than $1 trillion to build roads, bridges, railways, ports, and power plants in more than 70 countries. It's all part of China's overall strategy to steer global commerce to the east and reclaim its Silk Road heritage. The Madaraka Express from Mombasa to Nairobi is a big part of that strategy. At a cost of nearly $5 billion, it is the largest public works project in Kenya since colonial times. China claims it's a win-win for everyone, but some wonder, at what cost? Here's a special report from VOA's Africa Service.
It is the biggest public works project ever in Kenya, a $3.8 billion bet on the country's economic future. Sealed on a deal with China to help build a sprawling rail network in East Africa. They call it the Madaraka Express, after Kenyan Independence Day. And in its first year of operation, it has given Kenyans new freedom and optimism. A 10-hour drive time between the coastal city of Mombasa and the capital, Nairobi, slashed by half or more.
Really, there are no so many complaints comparing to the transport system that we're used to.
Shipping costs slashed by half too, a shot in the arm for business and, hopefully, new jobs. The train, more widely called the SGR for Standard Gauge Railway, is a critical link in something far bigger. China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion plan to finance and build railroads, ports, roads, and other huge projects in nearly 70 countries. China casts Belt and Road as a friendly effort to help emerging economies like Kenya's. But the deals are boon for China, too. Chinese state banks lend the money. Then, Chinese companies cash in on construction deals.
So these infrastructure projects are not altruistic aid projects. What the Chinese get out of it, or what Chinese companies get out of it, are lucrative infrastructure contracts where not only Chinese construction firms win these contracts, but they also pull along a number of smaller suppliers and other Chinese companies that also get to participate.
Belt and Road projects are certifying China's ascent to the top trade partner for African states.
If anything, it's an acceleration of existing trends that we've already seen for the past decade or more, where China has already overtaken the US in terms of being the primary economic partner for African countries and for the continent as a whole. Africa does not take the same priority in US foreign policy as perhaps it used to, and it doesn't occupy the same sort of attention. Whereas for China, the relationship has become, over a decade or more, very politically institutionalized.
And African countries are getting a payoff. An extensive survey by McKinsey Consulting found that thousands of Chinese-owned firms, some big, some small, are hiring, training, and promoting tens of thousands of African workers.
It's a win-win for me. If we don't have the standard gauge railway, if we don't have, we're going to be losing as an economy. The government, if they become lenient, we go back to our 80s and 90s, we will never grow as an economy.
Kemboi's story is one the Kenya government wants to reproduce. She landed a good-paying job after graduating from the railway's training school. The SGR's economics depend on more than cargo and passengers. To build the railway's first leg, Kenya borrowed almost all the $3.8 billion cost from the Chinese. Same for the next section, now under construction, another $1.5 billion. The debt makes China far and away Kenya's biggest lender. Repayment was forgiven for 5 years, but in 2019, loan obligations to the Chinese will rise more than fivefold. Critics fear the debt will make the SGR a long-term loser, a victim to China's debt trap diplomacy. Akshay Vishwanath is an environmental activist who studied SGR finances.
Any business, any country, any economy uses debt to grow. But the magnitude of that debt, the ability to repay, the magnitude of those loans in comparison to the gross domestic product, all does matter. And I don't think that level of analysis has been conducted for these projects. And therefore, I say we need to worry.
Across Africa, the needs are great. The Africa Development Bank said countries face an annual infrastructure funding gap of some $70 to $108 billion. China has pledged $60 billion in financing for Belt and Road projects in Africa. It's too early to say whether the Madaraka Express will be an engine of progress for all Kenyans. But there's no doubt it's already a win for the Chinese.
Just as diverse as the cultures of Africa are the opinions on what all the foreign investment is doing to the African continent. Here to discuss the African viewpoints on Chinese and African investment in Africa and everything that goes along with it, journalist Salim Solomon of VOA's Africa Division. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, can you start telling me what kind of investment does China have in Africa?
China focuses on loans, and they have commercial and concessional loans. So what concessional loans mean are low interest rate loans that are paid in long term. So they have agreements with no strings attached. And what that means is that they have they build these primarily focused on infrastructure projects all across the continent. They build dams, they build stadiums, they build buildings and all these roads that are across the continent from west to east, including the railway that we just noticed.
Well, you say no strings attached, but they expect to be paid back. So there is, to that extent, there's that China wants back. They want their money back.
Yes, and so the U.S. and China approached, kind of business relationship, completely fundamentally different because China does not have any prerequisites. So the U.S. has focused on its private sector, profit-driven, but all these companies have prerequisites in terms of, transparency, in terms of abiding by international or U.S. norms. But China doesn't have that. So these deals that they're making are opaque deals, backdoor discussions. Discussions that focus on some sort of agreement, some sort of concession that have long-term dividends for China along the way. So when they invest, for instance, they had a China-Africa Cooperation Forum in Beijing just recently, and Xi Jinping made an additional $60 billion for the continent's development in terms of loans, these concessional or commercial loans that they make promises with these African countries.
Well, what happens? I mean, in Sierra Leone, they defaulted on a loan. And so what did China do?
Actually, Sierra Leone just yesterday canceled a 40 million agreement that they had with China because there was an internal disagreement of some sort. But Djibouti is an outlier case that we can look at when the GDP is actually lower than the loans that China or assets the Chinese have in these countries, and there's a lot of concentration of international players in that country. There has been some fears of questions of sovereignty or taking over of sovereignty of these African countries because of what they've seen.
Has China taken back anything as a result of a failure to pay?
Well, from the reporting that we've been doing in the past year, that's a foregone conclusion. We have yet to see. China approaches a case-by-case kind of approach to these countries.
What is the United States? The United States says that they're doing it to partner, to make them self-reliant. But does the United States want more out of their method of investment?
So the United States, as I said, fundamentally does business completely different than what China does. So they allowed the private sector to have businesses. The government-funded initiatives only focus on education, health, and initiatives that are basically, have prerequisites and also international law, transparency, driven kind of approach to African countries. And these businesses, these private businesses are profit driven. So when they make any kind of deal with African countries, they do look at for profit. But there's also an initiative called AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which which has opened American businesses for African business for American market. And so that has allowed, it's a duty-free market where Africans can have a play in, and it's created 300,000 jobs. It's been very successful. We'll have yet to see how that will continue.
We only have about 30 seconds left. Who's got a bigger economic footprint into the African continent right now, China or the United States, if you know? Can't tell?
China has pledged 10 times higher investment in African countries than the U.S.
And what happens with that Kenya, that train is a very expensive train. That's a loan, and that's built by Chinese companies, and the people are trained by Chinese countries. Does Kenya really expect to be able to pay that back?
So the question here also is about enabling what if Kenya is going to be able to pay it back. We have yet to see. But what China is doing is also enabling corruption in these countries, where the African elite or governments are really making backdoor kickbacks, backdoor agreements, and opaque agreements that are not really privy to kind of transparent interactions. So that will haunt, I think, China in terms of enabling corruption in these countries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Last month, Chinese President Xi announced a $60 billion investment pledge, as we just learned, and that's for Africa. This on top of the $60 billion China had already pledged in 2015. But what is China and its business investors getting out of the deal? VOA Beijing Bureau Chief Bill Ai joins us via Skype from Beijing with answers to those questions and more. Bill, nice to see you. And what is the strategy or mission of China in doing these investments?
Nice to see you too, Greta. Well, the main message that China is trying to send, especially in the wake of last month's meeting, is that it's about development and it's not about debt traps. It made a lot of comments about these criticisms of possible neo-colonialism and about the possible debt problems that it's raising on the continent. We've known that for a long time. It's been about raw materials and about political influence. There's also geopolitical angles to what China is doing in Africa. But right now, one crucial aim is really, and this is especially now with the trade frictions with the U.S. rising, is China's trying to position itself to take advantage of economic growth opportunities in Africa. I don't know if you're familiar with Jack Ma, the head of China's giant e-commerce company. Recently, he made some comments about the trade frictions with the United States, and he said that if the U.S. doesn't want to do business with China, then we should just take it to other places like Africa. And I think that they're looking to Africa as one place to shift that trade. But we know, based on the figures that we've seen so far, that there's a lot of work that has to be done there. China has a goal to grow trade with Africa to about 440 billion by 2025. Last year, trade between the two was at 170 billion, which is no small number, but there's still a lot of room that they would need to grow to actually kind of take up the amount of trade if it was shifted away from the United States. So it does look at Africa as not only a place to build, but also to create opportunities. And that was another thing that was touched on last month at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and that was in industrial capacity, growing that and helping to train Africans. And that's something we're going to have to wait and see if they can really make that shift away from infrastructure towards more, focusing more not on the hardware but on the software.
We only have a minute left. How do you think the China view is of the way the United States is investing in Africa?
China's view of the way the United States, I think that they would not. It's a completely different approach. And they do, make the argument that there's no political strings attached, that we're not going to ask you to change your political system or to adopt our values. But as we've seen in instances already with the way that China has handled its relationships with other countries, that it's going to be asking at some point down the line, that's going to become an issue, and it will ask other countries to toe the line.
Bill, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
As you may have guessed by now, Africa has become a huge magnet for foreign investment. But why the sudden interest? In a word, it's all about the continent's potential. Millar Sega has more.
Even as Africa evokes images of lush jungles and wild animals, in most of its major cities, you're more likely to see traffic jams and people on their cell phones. Made up of 54 culturally and geographically diverse countries speaking more than 1,500 languages, the African continent is now home to 6 of the world's 10 fastest-growing economies. Boasting some of the world's largest mineral deposits, the continent produces 13% of the world's oil, and according to the World Economic Forum, up to 60% of the world's arable land. And yet, despite its natural abundance, political corruption and ethnic conflict continues to limit growth. So has the lack of infrastructure development. But that's changing. The U.S. has pledged to invest $14 billion in Africa over the next decade, a pledge topped by China, which has promised to invest $175 billion over the same period. With more than 1.3 billion people, Africa's population is also among the youngest, with a median age of 19.4 years. That's a lot of manpower to fuel growth and consumption as the continent comes of age. Demographic experts say Africa will account for more than half of the world's population growth by the year 2050, adding another 1.3 billion people to the planet. Investors are betting that where there are resources and large populations, commerce is sure to follow. Millar Sega, VOA News.
Before we go, something sinister. Where is Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi? This prominent Saudi journalist disappeared October 2nd. He was last seen entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. He was there with his fiancée to get a marriage license. Khashoggi was seen entering the building, but no one saw him leave. Not the cameras, not his fiancée, who was waiting outside for him. Turkish authorities believe Khashoggi may have been murdered inside the Saudi consulate, a charge Saudi officials have denied. Khashoggi, formerly an advisor to the Saudi government, had become a fierce critic of the Saudi government and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Last year, fearing for his safety, Khashoggi left Saudi Arabia and moved to the United States. Many worry his probable murder may be an escalation of suppressive tactics employed by the Crown Prince to silence his dissenters. On Monday, President Donald Trump expressed concern over Khashoggi's disappearance. Vice President Mike Pence tweeted, "Violence against journalists across the globe is a threat to the freedom of the press and to human rights." Now, 1 week after Khashoggi's disappearance, Saudi officials have agreed to allow Turkish investigators to search the consulate. We'll let you know what they learn as soon as we have that new information. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my personal Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And you can follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.